I'm Shots from Football Outsiders. This is the Sabermetrics Video Network, and today I want to talk about the New York Giants. Some people were surprised when they opened up Football Outsiders Almanac 2012 and found that the Giants have a mean projection of only 8.3 wins. It seems a little odd for a team coming off a Super Bowl victory. The problem is that the team, of course, was not that good in the regular season last year. They only went 9-7. The projection system is generally projecting them based on how they played in the regular season, not how they did in the playoffs. Jason Lisk of TheBigLead.com thought this was a little odd, so he went back into Football Outsiders' DVOA archives to try to figure out if how well a team played in the playoffs ended up having an effect on how well it did the following year compared to similar teams. Jason took a look at the 10 wildcard teams that made it to the Super Bowl, starting with the Giants, of course, but also teams like the 2010 Packers, the 2008 Cardinals, 2005 Steelers, 2003 Carolina, so forth and so on. So Jason took all the wildcard Super Bowl teams and looked for a group of similar teams with similar DVOA ratings that didn't make it to the Super Bowl. Then he compared the following year's rating for the wildcard Super Bowl teams and the similar teams. As you can see, the wild card Super Bowl teams tended to get better the next year. The similar teams got worse. He also looked at teams which went 10-6 or worse and made it to the conference championships. That allows us to include teams like, for example, Jacksonville in 1996 and Philadelphia in 2008. When you look at these teams, they also improved the following year, and similar teams which had similar DVOA ratings in the first season get worse the following season. Of course, an advantage of being Football Outsiders is that we have the play-by-play, and we can create playoff DVOA. So instead of looking at how well teams played in the playoffs based on how far they got, we can actually look at whether teams played better in the playoffs than they did during the regular season, and what happens to teams that are worse in the playoffs than they are during the regular season. Of course, we're Football Outsiders, and we have the rating, so we can go through and create playoff DVOA for past years and see not which teams won more games than were expected by win-loss record, but which teams actually played better than expected by DVOA. We went through and created DVOA for every team going back to 1991 based on 16, 17, 18, 19, or 20 games, depending on how many games they played that season. Then we wanted to see what regression towards the mean we could expect from every team. We used a simple equation for offense that we introduced in the Cincinnati chapter of Football Outsiders Almanac 2012, and we created a similar equation for defense. Here are the surprise playoff teams that Jason wrote about in his article. As you can see, on average, these teams did a lot better the following season compared to the regression towards the mean that we would have expected otherwise. Now, not all of these teams are exactly the same. Some of these teams were only surprises compared to their win-loss record. When it compared to their season DVOA, they really weren't surprises. In fact, the 2008 Eagles actually played worse in the playoffs than they did during the regular season, according to our ratings, and the 1992 Bills were also worse in the playoffs, although mostly just on offense. So what happens if instead of looking at these specific teams, we look at every team that's been in the playoffs since 1991? We went and looked. We compared their playoff DVOA compared to their season DVOA that only uses the regular season. Then we compared their rating in offense and defense the following year compared to what we would have expected based on simple regression towards the mean, no other variables involved. I started by looking overall at the correlation of DVOA to the next year's DVOA for all playoff teams, based on whether or not we included the playoff games in the rating. As you can see, the correlation is a little bit better if you include the playoff games, although it's not a huge difference. And yes, this really does say that the weighted ratings, which give more credit towards the end of the season, are less predictive of the following year than the full year ratings. It turns out that things look a lot stronger if we only look at teams that improved in the playoffs in one group and teams that declined in the playoffs in another group. So, for example, this is a graph showing all of the teams that played better on offense in the playoffs than they did in the regular season since 1991. That's the x-axis. The y-axis here is what they did the following year on offense compared to what we would have expected from standard regression towards the mean. As you can see, there's a definite trend where teams that play better on offense in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, in turn then play better on offense the following year than we would have expected from standard regression towards the mean. This effect looks even stronger if we take care of three very particular outlier teams, which are shown here in red. These teams include the Indianapolis Colts after Peyton Manning's injury, the Cardinals after the retirement of Kurt Warner, and the Broncos after the retirement of John Elway. It's really no surprise that these teams were not as good on offense the following year. Now, if we take them out, we will discover that every team that was at least 2.5 percentage of points of DVOA better on offense in the playoffs than during the regular season was in turn at least as good and probably better than the expected DVOA the following year, with one exception, and that is the 93-94 LA Raiders. Otherwise, this definitely suggests that teams that play much better on offense in the playoffs than they did in the regular season should be expected to be better on offense the following year. I know what you're saying. Which is the team from last year's playoffs that was that much better on offense in the postseason? The answer is that none of them were. Most of the teams that improved in the postseason last year improved primarily on defense, and that includes the Giants. Here's the other side of that. These are teams that played worse on offense in the playoffs than they did during the regular season. There does seem to be an effect here because on average these teams were worse than expected the following year. But it doesn't seem like the worse you are in the playoffs, the worse you then are the next year. The trend line here is basically flat. Turning it around to look at defense, again, we see a trend here. The better the defense plays in the playoffs, which is, of course, lower in DVOA because it's preventing scoring, the better the defense plays in the playoffs, the better it's going to probably be the next year compared to what generally would have been expected from regression towards the mean. By the way, that one team that's way out there on the left with the amazing defense in the playoffs is the 2000 Baltimore Ravens. Interestingly, when we look at teams that played worse defense in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, there is no trend whatsoever, no correlation at all to how well these teams did on defense the following season. In conclusion, although it's hard to come up with exact numbers, it does seem that our projection systems for the 2012 season have underrated the New York Giants, that their improvement in the playoffs last year does mean something, and we will try to take this into account when we do our updated preseason predictions on footballoutsiders.com, which always come out a couple of days before the regular season starts in early September. Of course, if we're going to improve the projection for the Giants, we also have to improve the projection for other teams that played better in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, which means slightly higher projections for Houston, which was better in the playoffs on defense, and New England, which is kind of funny since the Patriots already have the highest projection in the league. Oh well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, especially if the goose is from New Jersey and the gander is from Foxborough. For the Sabermetrics Video Network, I'm Aaron Schatz from footballoutsiders.com. See you again soon.